Welcome to the Rethink Vertical podcast, where we cut through the hype. This podcast brings you emerging aviation technology insight without the fluff, so you know where the industry is today to shape the future of tomorrow. Welcome to the Rethink Vertical podcast. This episode is sponsored by the UAS Cluster Initiative. So today I sit down with the CEO and co-founder of infiniDome, Omer Sharar. infiniDome develops innovative GPS protection and navigation resiliency solutions tailored for defending UAVs and ground vehicles from jamming attacks. With disruptive cost, size, weight, and power features, infiniDome's solutions bring the highest grade of protection even to small UAS, ensuring their capability and ability to complete their critical missions. Their solutions are disrupting the defense and homeland security markets today and will do the same to the commercial markets, enabling the beyond visual line of sight and autonomous drone delivery future. So our conversation today is centered around a few different topics. We talked about GPS and its vulnerabilities, how those vulnerabilities affect commercial and defense UAS operations from safety and cyber perspectives, and finally, infiniDome's current solutions to mitigate the problem and what's missing today. So I hope you enjoy the episode. All right, welcome to the podcast today, Rethink Vertical podcast, and my guest today is Omer Sharar with infiniDome. And Omer, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Craig, and thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, no, I'm always excited to chat with companies that have that sort of catalyzing technology to help kind of turn the UAS and advanced air mobility space into an actual industry. And so, interested to chat with you a little bit. I know infiniDome, just for some backgrounds, disruptive GPS protection and resilient navigation solutions technology. So Omer, if you could, it'd be great to just hear a little bit about you, where you come from, and how infiniDome came about.
Sure. So a little bit about myself. I'm an engineer by trade, studied mathematics and computer science, and worked in R&D for a long time, relatively long time. But I worked in the GPS space on and off for about 15 years. Mainly in the P&T space, positioning, navigation, and timing, more on the timing space. So I basically was a solution provider in Israel for telcos, for the finance industries, for critical infrastructure, for the defense industries, also on how to distribute accurate time, which is derived from GPS. And one of my customers, before I founded infiniDome, this was back in 2015, one of my customers back then asked me a very interesting question, which is, how do your systems, meaning the systems that I provided in Israel, that were made by a very large American manufacturer of atomic clocks and timing systems, how do they bounce back after being jammed? And that was actually the first time that I said, how am I supposed to even check that? I'm not, the Israeli Defense Forces or the DoD. How am I supposed to check such a thing? That's when, I looked online. I saw that I can buy a GPS jammer for about $20. I was horrified to find out that it reached the kiosk next to my house. I'm holding it right here if everybody's seeing this. And when I click this little button over here that I have, I created a beautiful denial of service attack of GPS, which affected a $10,000 GPS-based time server. It affected my iPhone. It affected any kind of GPS receiver. It doesn't matter if it's on a drone or a car or whatever. And that's basically when I said, well, there's a big gap. There's a big void in the industry, because all of the solutions that I found to be able to protect from such an attack were super high-end military solutions that look like an old VCR, cost $50,000 and up, extremely classified ITAR and the equivalents, and were simply irrelevant, not to protect a $10,000 timing server, let alone a small quadcopter, large class 1 or class 2 quadcopter or multicopter. That's when I understood that there's a big void in the industry today, a big vulnerability that needs answering by what we call proportional defense. And that got me thinking, trying to figure out how the big boys are doing it. What can we do differently? And then I founded the company in June 2016, along with my two co-founders, Ehud and Moshe. When we thought, hey, we have an idea of how to do this on a much smaller form factor, lighter, cheaper, maybe not as good, but definitely a layer of protection that is very critical to 97% of the applications in the military and 100% of the applications in commercial, which have no access to any kind of existing anti-jamming systems today.
Right, right. So when we talk about GPS, I mean, most folks are pretty familiar with GPS generally. Everybody has on their phones in their cars. In the aerospace industry, obviously aircraft use it as well. How is it used specifically that most folks maybe are not aware of? And then also, what are some of the major vulnerabilities? Obviously, you showed that little GPS jamming device probably is not super expensive and pretty easy to carry around. What are some of the issues that you guys are trying to solve?
Well, I mean, first of all, let's start a little bit about, GPS. Everybody knows it, as you said. Everybody uses it on Waze and Google or whatever on their phones. And as we said, it's sort of this common thread that is being used in, I think, 12 out of 15 critical industries that, have been flagged out by DHS. If somebody takes out GPS, that's a massive, massive impact on the industry. But GPS is the American satellite system. It's comprised of somewhere between 24 and 31 satellites orbiting Earth at 20,000 kilometers above ground. But like GPS, that is owned by and run by the Americans, there's GLONASS, the Russian system, which surprisingly almost everybody uses around the world, Galileo, the European system, Beidou, the Chinese system, and a few geostationary systems. All in all, we're talking roughly of 100 vehicles, 100 satellites orbiting Earth. But the problem is that they're all, first of all, I have to say GPS or GNSS, which is the acronym for all of the constellations, it's mind-blowing technology. Really, it solves an amazing problem implementing Einstein's theory of relativity on a receiver that today you can buy for $2, which give you unbelievable accuracy, even on things like this, our phones, right? And the thing is that all of these constellations, the GNSS, the Global Navigation Satellite System, the acronym for all of those constellations, they use the same frequencies. It's called the L band. L1, about 1575 megahertz, L2, L5, and other such bands. So they're all using a predetermined and constant frequency. And the biggest problem is that the signal strength by the time it reaches Earth is extremely weak. I always say that it's about the equivalent of if you take a 20-watt light bulb, light it up in California, and try to receive its signal in New York. That's about how weak the GPS signal is when it reaches our receivers. Now, the receivers have been gotten, incredibly accurate, cheap, and very, very fast. But that doesn't solve this inherent problem that the signal is extremely weak. So all you have to do to create this denial of service attack, this jamming attack of GPS, is actually to transmit something, anything really, in that same frequency range. And this is what this little guy over here does. It transmits something at about 0.2 watts. And when I click this little button over here, in a vicinity of about 100 meters from me, nobody has GPS, and it's that simple. Even, the military, which uses GPS, sometimes encrypted GPS, which is called M code or SASM, they still use that very, very weak signal to do that. So all you have to do to jam it, again, to create that denial of service attack, is to transmit something in those frequencies, L1, L2, or L5, or all three of them, a little bit more powerful than that very, very weak signal that you're trying to receive on those satellites, on those receivers, on those applications. What we do at infiniDome is basically we decided to take the approach that many of the big guys are doing, which are developing anti-jamming systems, and have been doing so for a long time on large platforms, large systems, large modules, sometimes as big as an old VCR. Those of us who remember what a VCR is.
That's right.
And yeah, I have to remember that a lot of the audience is probably not as old as I am.
Right. We know what a beta was, what a beta and
exactly. But about as big as that, about as heavy as that, ranging from 2 kilos all the way up to 10 kilos. I'm sorry, I'm in Israel, so I use the kilo system. And costing, tens of thousands of dollars. Most of these systems cost like $50,000 and up, extremely classified and ITAR restricted. And they were defined by the DARPAs out there and their equivalents to protect fighter jets and helicopters and battleships, and definitely are irrelevant in terms of CSWAP, cost, size, weight, and power, to protect multicopters, fixed-wing UAVs, or even vehicles because of mainly their price. And that's what we came to change. We do not come and say we can make better anti-jamming systems than, the big boys out there, whether it be Israeli aerospace industries, Elbit in Israel, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, or those. We come and say we can create something smaller, lighter, cheaper, a lot more accessible to the 95% of the applications out there that can't afford those high-end anti-jamming systems. That's exactly what we come to solve at infiniDome.
Yeah. And we can maybe get into some of those details in a little bit. Before we do that, I know of some high profile GPS jamming incidents, and I think it happens a lot more than folks realize. So a couple things. What are some of the most recent incidents that you've seen and kind of their impacts? And we can chat a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that everybody is very, very well aware of what's going on in the Ukraine right now.
Yeah.
And, Ukraine has taught us that, even when they have really, really great systems, multicopters or fixed wing UAVs, their biggest Achilles heel, their biggest vulnerability is GPS. And EW is widely used by the Russians and has been used even before this war. And right now, it's the way that they're taking down an immense number of their aerial vehicles, their especially unmanned, UAVs, etc. But what happened, and I've seen this, year over year since this war started, is that the understanding of this vulnerability has spread well beyond this conflict area. So a lot of countries in Eastern Europe and Western Europe has been understanding that, they have to prepare for this. And everybody understands around the globe, it doesn't matter if it's in the US, in India, or even Australia, understand that the next conflict will look like this. So in the military, it has been quite clear, and now it's even more clear, that you have to protect anything that's in the air or on the ground that is completely dependent and reliant on GPS. On the commercial side, we've had a few incidences that, not necessarily are in conflict zones. And we've seen this in the United States, for example. About a year ago, Denver Airport was jammed for about 48 hours. The source is still not known, but de facto what happened is that the air traffic basically just was significantly reduced because they had to revert to manual operations. I think in Texas about 4 months ago, the same thing happened, and flights were actually rerouted from the Texas airport to adjacent airports because of that fact. Actually, an interesting thing is happening in the U.S., and we're seeing a lot of jamming incidences on the U.S.-Mexico border because cartels are using GPS jammers to be able to hide from DHS drones and DHS activities that are using GPS to monitor all of those borders. And actually, there's sort of using GPS jammers to make those monitoring systems a little bit blind, to have UAVs not, fly around them. So we're seeing a lot of incidences on the border and especially inside Mexico that has to do with jamming. Besides that, in Israel, we are a company based out of Israel. We have many not so friendly neighbors.
Right.
The silver lining of this is that we are being contested all day, every day, from all of our borders on the north with Syria and Lebanon, on the southwest from the Gaza Strip, and we are seeing these challenges always, and different challenges. The good thing is that this allows us to do what we do very well and test it very quickly. So it's a very good test bed. If we succeed here, we can succeed in a lot of places. But this thing is, as I said, it's actually, interestingly enough, there was about 2 years ago a task force called Strike 3 that was run by the EU. And basically what they did is they spread about 40 monitoring stations across Western Europe. This is, Spain, UK, France, etc. And all they did was monitor how many GPS jamming attacks they're seeing. And then this is stationary, right? So it's not the total
Mm,
amount. They
right.
found an incredible amount of about 50,000 high-powered GPS jamming attacks through a period of about 18 months.
Wow.
So the problem is there. It's getting worse. And of course, it's very understandable because to be able to jam GPS, you don't have to be a fancy hacker with a big server or computer. You need 20 bucks in your pocket. You need to buy something off one of those Chinese websites, and you need a finger to click this to create a denial of
Mm,
service attack. So when it's no longer a big soldier lugging around a big bag with a bunch of antennas, when the threat actually looks like this guy and you can amplify that signal with off-the-shelf things you buy on Amazon today, the threat is very different. And that's why the protection also has to look very different from what we were used to until now.
yeah. Yeah, you talked about those couple of commercial incidents, which I'm pretty familiar with in my past life, working at the command center, putting out those advisories and how those GPS, whether they're jamming attacks, whether they're intentional or not, I mean, they're super impactful for airlines who, do the majority of their route work via GPS. And so if you have to revert back to traditional navigations and nav aids, and it's super. Mostly that means canceled flights because they got to reduce the volume just so they can manage that new traffic flows.
Yeah, and
Um,
I think you asked me one more question that I didn't refer to, so I apologize for running into your things. But one of the
no,
things
there
that
you
you
go.
asked me is how GPS is being used also, on the UAV space, UAS space, and I think that's a very important question because not a lot of people are aware of it. You're very right, by the way. For commercial aviation, having GPS or not having GPS basically means I need to do a different protocol. It might take longer, but
Mm-hmm.
thank God, no planes have been taken down because of GPS jamming because they have kick-ass, pardon my French,
Yeah,
um, INSs and inertial navigation systems that can take them and they can do revert to manual processes, etc.
right.
But the problem with UAVs or unmanned systems in general is that they have to use their sensors not only to get from point A to point B, but actually to stay in the air, to stabilize, and especially to do any kind of BV loss activities beyond visual line of
Mm-hmm.
sight. So even altitude hold, position hold, all of those
Mm-hmm.
great things that we get for free from our wonderful, controllers, whether it be PICSOC or DJIs or whatever
Mm-hmm.
UAS we're going to use right now, that is taken away immediately in GPS. And the problem is, it's not taken away and saying, oh, the drone is saying, oh, I don't know what to do. I don't have GPS. I'm going to land safely. No,
Right, right.
when you're seeing a drone being jammed, and I've seen this multiple times, and seeing an operator panicking when they're seeing this happen in real life is unbelievable because the drone it doesn't say I don't know what to do and land. It usually tries to maintain its positioning although it's being severely compromised, which means that it starts to act very aggressively. It usually takes a very, very sharp angle and drifts away in seconds. It
Mm,
usually either runs out of battery and crashes a few kilometers away, or runs into something adjacent to it. And if there's an operator there, he can grab control, and if he's talented enough, that's great.
yeah.
But most of the time, that's how you lose drones. That's how most of our customers and our potential customers use their systems today. And that's why it's extremely vulnerable. And that's why it's extremely important to add this, another layer of security
Mm,
to be able to cope with these kinds of attacks when you're running any kind of UAV operation.
yeah. No, I appreciate that, and I'm glad we went back to cover that because I think it's so different than regular traditional aviation, right? You said there's lots of backups for aircraft, right? So if GPS goes out, there's other options with an aircraft that's flying autonomously, especially BB loss. There's not a lot of backups. So that kind of leads me to the next question: What other than GPS, what can we use out there for this type of technology? If GPS is so vulnerable, and let's say that you're not protecting it, what are companies trying to do to sort of bypass GPS?
Well, I mean, the go-to approach that is widely used by defense forces is it's called vision nav. It's taking a camera or the main camera of the vehicle and trying to use it to navigate.
Mm,
Now, to some applications, I think that's a great approach. For example, if you want to stay in place and you can look at a spot on the ground, you can actually do a pretty good job at staying in place. If you want to track something, a vehicle or something like that, using a camera is the way to go. But the problem is that to navigate in, especially in unfamiliar territory, or if vision is impaired, that could create a very big problem. So that system, and likewise when you're using other sensors like LiDARs or radars or stuff like that, sometimes they don't work. And a lot of times they don't work well enough. For example, even if you have a very, very good camera and very good algorithms running in the background trying to help you to navigate, when you're doing this in darkness, when you're doing this in fog, in rain, too high, too low, flying above desert area when everything looks yellow, or above
Right.
green fields or above the ocean, that creates a very big problem and a lot of mistakes. And that's when you come back to use GPS. Now you have other sensors. For example, I talked about inertial sensors before for commercial aviation. There are fantastic solutions also for drones out there. But the problem with an INS is usually what you pay in terms of money and in terms of weight is what you get, which means that if you cannot afford a $50,000 commercial aerospace grade INS on your drone, it's going to drift away very quickly. And the problem is that, like clocks, an INS drifts away not linearly, it drifts away exponentially, which means that you can probably maintain a pretty good position for about a minute, but then it starts to drift away very, very quickly. And our approach in, when talking about anti-jamming, and I'm bringing it back to our solution, is yes, to have this extra layer of security, either with our GPS Dome 1, which is a small, anti-jamming system that could be mounted on even, even a small drone. And it is retrofit, meaning that you can install it in line with any receiver you have or any controller you have and just add a secondary antenna. I can tell you a little bit about how it works in a second.
Yeah.
Um, or when that is not enough, because that protects you from a single direction of attack, and that makes your drone about 20 times more resilient to such an attack than without any kind of protection. And obviously, I view this as a no-brainer. Add this extra layer of security. It doesn't affect your payload that much. It gives you a lot more peace and quiet. But when that's not enough, when you're flying in more challenged area, more contested areas, you have our second generation, which is called GPS Dome 2, that can protect from 3 directions of attack and gives you dual band protection and much better protection. But always my spiel to customers, and especially when they're out on critical missions, and critical missions can be in defense, in homeland security, but can also be on the commercial side. If you're flying people or flying medical equipment over people and you need to complete your mission, no matter what, I say don't trust GPS. Don't even trust protected GPS. Use multiple layers of resiliency.
Right.
And, in the automotive industry, we call this sensor fusion. And this is exactly what we're trying to push people to do. And we've actually partnered with Honeywell. Honeywell is both an investor in the company, and we created a joint solution together, which actually creates multiple layers of resiliency. And it combines an INS, which aggregates inputs both from protected GPS by our anti-jamming system and a radar velocity system, which allows for alternative navigation, which is not dependent on GPS. And the fusion of this entire thing is not to create a single point of failure. And
Right.
obviously, not everybody can afford this, but when you have a critical mission to execute, you need to think about not only getting it done in ideal circumstances, but always think about what if. And that's my main message, to customers. And sometimes that's a little bit, shooting myself in the leg, because I'm saying, hey,
Right.
don't even trust me. But I'm
Right.
saying test, test, and test again. One of the biggest problems that I've had is actually testing, and testing for jamming is a challenge, because when I turn this little button over here, I'm breaking the law.
Yeah. Right.
Transmitting anything in GPS is breaking the law unless you're doing it in a confined area under, specific approvals.
Right.
But we have to start changing that, because if we don't test, and if the bad guy can access this kind of technology with $20 in his pocket, we need to push people to test more. And as I said, think about the what ifs.
Yeah. So what is all the other ANSPs? Let's talk about FA. What's their thought on GPS? I mean, I know they understand GPS from a traditional aerospace, but are they thinking about rules and regulations that need to be applied to UAS and AM before these rulemakings come down? What are they thinking?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. I think that the first time we've ever had any formal kind of entity to raise a flag saying you have to take care of GPS is when the White House issued Executive Order 13905. That was about 2.5 years ago, when they called for something called responsible use of GPS. It was a very, very blurry kind of thing. Nobody really understood what they're talking about. And then a few other entities started looking at that. One of them is DOT, FAA. One of them is ANSI, American National Standards Institute. And they issued something called Roadmap to UAS Standardization. This is about a year and a half ago, if I'm not mistaken, summer of 21. And what they wrote over there is a few industry gaps that must be bridged before going BVLOS. One of those gaps, called Gap A8, specifically calls for means to mitigate GPS jamming. So that said, they sort of said, all right, this is a big gap that must be bridged before we do that. Then the FAA, more or less in the same time, assembled the Aviation Rulemaking Committee,
Right.
which sort of takes in ANSI's inputs and says, okay, how are we supposed to do that? And they tapped in a few of the standards bodies. One of them is SAE. And we actually started working with SAE. And the first thing that we're writing together, actually, it's a work in progress committee, which we hope to release really in the coming weeks, which is called, I forgot its name. I apologize. I forgot its number.
Too many acronyms, right? Yeah.
But it's basically it's a definition of resilience for GPS or GNSS receivers. And basically, we talk about there how to take an off-the-shelf GPS receiver, how to make it more resilient with anti-jamming solutions. And then we're actually talking about how to make it more resilient with, again, off-the-shelf kind of alternative layers. And again, as I said, fusing those layers or integrating those layers into creating a much more resilient kind of solution. One of the things that today is happening, as we all know, is everybody's operating mostly under the 107, under the Part 107 for drones.
Right.
One of the things that I've recently looked at is the exact wording of waivers that are given to operators that want to go BVLOS,
Right.
and specifically ask and apply and receive waivers of BVLOS for Part 107. And in that waiver, the exact phrasing is that when GPS is lost or when GPS integrity is being degraded, you have to cease operations immediately.
Right. Yeah. I've seen that many times. Yeah.
And one of the biggest problems is that sometimes when you are seeing that GPS is lost or GPS integrity is being degraded, that's a little bit too late. And that's exactly when we come in and saying, first of all, let's talk about where, when, and on which platforms you have to add extra protection. And second of all, we are also building a tool that helps operators. It doesn't matter if it's UTM providers like an extra layer. It doesn't matter if it's a testing site, or it doesn't matter if it's drone operators or municipalities. We're building a tool that helps you detect early detection, a little bit like a heat map of where GPS integrity is being challenged or compromised. The idea is that to create a little bit like a weather map. So at least to give you a heads up when, where GPS is being challenged, and at the very least, help you do some route planning of how not to bump into that storm and realize that things are too late. Because today, the biggest problem is that drone makers and drone operators don't differentiate. And this is also in the military, by the way. 99%, you don't differentiate between not having GPS and being attacked. That's a very, very big difference. And sometimes, as you mentioned, attacks can be intentional, like cargo thief, a truck robber that uses GPS to jam a truck and to rob it in Mexico or on the border. Or military jamming that has just spread a little bit
Mm,
wider than where it was supposed to do, or I don't know, some antenna going haywire and starting to transmit instead of only receiving and creating a big area of GPS jamming, completely unintentional.
right, right. Yeah, and it's in those types of whether it's an attack or not, and we've seen this. You talk about some of these mishaps or GPS jamming, like at Denver and down in Texas. They never find out what happens because it's there's just there's no real way to track those type of attacks. Right, once the signal is off, it's gone. There's no way to locate it. So um, can you, Omer, can you dig a little bit deeper into your guys' solution? I know you talked about, you've got something that you can mount onto the actual drone. And I know that drone manufacturers, that keeps them up at night adding anything to their platform because of the whole weight battery
Yep.
calculation. As far as like a UTM provider or a system provider, is there a larger piece of equipment that will protect an entire piece of airspace? Like what's your guys' solution right now?
Well, our anti-jamming solution, by definition, basically has to be connected directly to your receiver, meaning that it has
Okay.
to be mounted on every platform that requires protection. Basically, a little bit about the technology. The technology behind it is called null steering. So most of the listeners have probably heard of beamforming. Beamforming is used by 5G cellular stations, for example, and it's basically taking several antennas and trying to receive as best as possible from a single direction to enhance bandwidth, etc. Null steering, I call it the evil sister of beamforming. Basically, instead of receiving as best as possible that I can from a single vector or a single direction, I'm trying to receive as poorly as possible from that single direction, which allows me to attenuate the energy that is being received by the big bad jammer. So I always like to compare it a little bit like going outside of your house in a very bright day. You're getting blinded by the sun and you can't see anything. If you take your hand and you hold it up against the sun, you can see much better around you.
Hmm.
This is a little bit what we're doing, but only in a geospatial way using multiple antennas. So as I said, our first generation GPS dome, you saw this bulk. It's a chunk of plastic, etc. And this is
Right.
about 150 grams. We have a version of this, which is a board. It's 35 grams, which makes it a lot even easier to integrate and,
Yeah.
not really affecting the whole weight versus battery ratio. And this thing uses two antennas and combines them to be able to protect from a single direction of attack. When we're talking about our second generation, that takes up to four antennas, combines them, and creates up to protection from three directions of attack in each frequency that it protects. Now, one of the biggest challenges that we've had to develop that, and what differentiates us from other manufacturers that are doing it, or the big bad 10,000-pound defense gorillas that have been doing this for a
Hmm.
long time, is that we are using our own RFIC to do this, our own chip, and
Okay.
which allows us to do this much in a smaller platform. And we're using off-the-shelf antennas, meaning that we don't need something called a SERPA antenna array. A SERPA antenna array is a very classified, usually large kind of thing that, again, when you're flying a fighter jet, that's probably okay. When you're flying a drone, mounting something spherical that looks like a frisbee on top of your drone is not a lot of fun. So
Right.
we are using off-the-shelf antennas, regular omnidirectional FERPA antennas that can be bought for even $20. But of course, there are no free lunches. We're not as good as the high-end solutions. We're not, we're a third of the smallest thing out there in terms of size, of weight, but also in terms of performance. We're not neck to neck with all of those big guys. But as I
Hmm.
said, we bring proportional defense. We come to a knife fight with a very, very good knife. We don't come with a bazooka.
Right, right. That's a good analogy. And I think for most drone manufacturers or operators, that's really they're looking to hedge their bets, right? They're looking to lower the number of times that they lose GPS as opposed to completely protect it for 50,000 per drone, which is probably three
Yeah,
times the
and
cost of their drone. So yeah.
you asked something very good before when it's when you're running a drone operation, not necessarily needing, especially if it's not mandated to protect every single one of those drones, especially if for example, you're flying burgers in North Carolina, right?
Right, right,
And then the entire bill of material of your drone is less than 10K. You're not going to put, this weight on. Doesn't matter if it's
right.
cheaper than a lot cheaper than anything out there today. One of the things that we are actually launching this year are a combination of sensor and cloud approach. And we're thinking that if you're going to operate in a specific area, we are developing something that look like a lot like IoT sensors, a single board that is completely standalone. It can be mounted on the drone. It can be mounted on vehicles. It even can be mounted on critical infrastructure. Theoretically, on light towers or
Hmm.
power poles or whatever. And basically, what those sensors do is they detect high-powered interferences, attacks, and
Hmm.
they automatically report and aggregate all of those data, and of course, ongoing GNSS monitoring data as well, into our cloud. And what we are doing right now is working on taking that information and offering it to be able to be integrated as part of another layer of a UTM, for example. So
Right.
if you have a UTM, you're looking at airspace and you're looking at weather maps and you're looking at other considerations, traffic maps and stuff like that.
Hmm.
We're thinking about adding another layer to there to give you heat maps of at least, where GPS and when exactly in real time GPS is being challenged, and give you information and at least give you some kind of tool in your tool belt, first of all, to avoid these areas. And second of all, to
Right.
come to FAA and say, I can at least give a heads up when things are going southwards and before things are going southwards.
Right. Right. Now, I'll be interested to see how that technology plays out. That's, I think, that'd be a real value add for especially UTM providers. It's all about data, right? Getting good data and to prove your safety case to the FAA as well.
Yeah.
Um, one last thing, Omer, before we wrap up here, you mentioned you started infiniDome with some other founders in 2016. I know we have quite a few founders that listen to the podcast, and they're kind of in the thick of it as you are.
Yeah.
What have you learned? What are some things that maybe you wish you would have done different since founding the company?
Um, well, we talked this a little bit before the show. We are in a tough area, like a lot of our listeners, I suppose. We dare to build hardware. We're manufacturing and building it either
Right.
in-house or in Israel. We are a lot in the defense industry, and when you're selling to, U.S. DoD or Israeli Defense Forces, we are not a sexy company like a cyber software
Hmm.
B2B company that, ups their valuation every year and,
Right.
raises $1 gajillion and does a SPAC when they have a, sales cycle of less than $1 million.
Right.
Um, so yes, I do have a lot of complaints here. I have a bucket full. So definitely, it's been a battle uphill. I have to say that one of the things that I've learned is that as early as possible, you have to understand, um, even if you think that you fully understand it, you have to focus, especially on the pain point of your customer.
Mm.
And, we are protecting GPS. As I said in the beginning, GPS is everywhere. I
Mm.
come from the timing industry, critical infrastructure. It's in automotive, it's in autonomous vehicles. And in the beginning, we blasted all of those directions in, automatic weapon style and hoping to hit a bird. And it's the wrong approach. You have to understand the pain point as early as possible. You have to understand exactly what is the pain point and who it hurts, and if and how you can solve it as quickly as possible. So to bring a product market fit, we call it, as early as possible to solve that pain. When you've understood the pain point and you understood the customers and how it hurts them and how you can solve it, even if it's not perfect solution, but it does clearly adds value to your customers, I think that's the key to success. And in terms of that's general kind of thing.
Right.
In terms of raising money for a company like ours, I have to say that it has to go from strategic investors.
Mm.
Um, we are sometimes a subsystem in a subsystem inside of an aircraft, a UAV or whatnot. And we are, sometimes in the beginning when I pitched our technology and our company to 95% of the investors, it was like talking Chinese. And you simply understand that you have to, first of all, do a lot of screening to make sure that you're talking to the right people. And the biggest inflection point in the company, I have to say, was when Honeywell chose to invest in us. And
Right.
because they're market leaders in aerospace, they're now building tremendous technology and solutions for the UAV space. And after validating our technology and understanding that we have something very, very unique that adds value to them, I think that not only did we find a great partner for go-to-market and building joint technology together, and of course, being able to finance the company a little bit,
Sure.
it also brings you a lot of market validation that is extremely, extremely required. And
Mm.
even to traditional investors, give a lot more indication that even if they don't know exactly what you're doing and your technology behind it, and to validate it, they sort of have a trusted big name that says, I trust these guys, they know what they're talking about, and they're solving a very important problem.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, totally agree. And I've heard that from a couple different companies, that strategic investment when you're building some especially a hardware, not a SaaS company, it's so important for, you know, the number of investors that understand your technology is probably, you can count them on one hand in the world. So you need folks that can't dive into the details to trust what you're doing, and I think having that strategic partner provides us some reliability for them. So real good words, real wise words for folks out there. Omer, it's been great to chat with you. I'm sure this won't be the last time we talk, but I appreciate you sharing a little bit about infiniDome and what you guys are doing, and we'll make sure folks can get a hold of you if when we do our outro here. So check out what they're doing and can keep tabs on the new technology you guys are building every day. So really appreciate you joining Rethink Vertical, Omer.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Craig, and always happy to help, even if it's just to consult or advise. So anybody that needs to pick my brain on this topic or any topic, feel free to reach out.
If you'd like to be a part of the UAS Cluster Initiative community and get access to more of our content, check us out at www.uascluster.com.